you got your Bibles, get them out, please. We're going to start in Luke 5 for a little bit, and then we'll be in Mark chapter 3. So you might want to keep your finger in both of those. We're going to we'll go back to a story that we didn't finish before, and then continue on with the story. Year's about 30 A.D., 2,000 years ago, and God's people have been regathered from exile and have been living in the promised land for over 400 years now. And the city of Jerusalem and the temple have been rebuilt after having been destroyed by the Babylonians about 600 BC. And the people of Israel are now waiting. They are waiting for the promise of God. They're waiting for his Messiah, his chosen one, to arrive. And at this point in history, they've been waiting for this promise for 400 years, like I said. In 1 year, as the people gathered in Jerusalem, as usual, as they do every year, the annual Passover feast, a man named Jesus from a rather obscure town in the province of Galilee called Nazareth shows up in Jerusalem, and he begins to announce that he's the Messiah. He is the promised one of God. And he backs up those claims by miraculously healing people of anything and everything that he encounters. There's no affliction of man that Jesus cannot heal, including even supernatural affliction. Jesus demonstrates he has authority over the natural world. He can heal diseases and fix broken limbs and give sight to the blind. He can drive fish into nets and turn water into wine. And he even has the power to raise the dead back to life. And Jesus also demonstrates that he has authority over the spiritual world. He can free people from the oppression of even the demons. When he commands them to go, they obey and they flee at his word. And so as you can imagine, this is quite a phenomenon. The people are astounded at what's happening. They're astounded at his teaching, and they're amazed at his miracles, and they begin to flock to him wherever he shows up. And all this attention that Jesus begins to garner from the people does not go unnoticed by the powers that be at the time either, the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jewish people. They begin also to take note of what he's doing and what he's saying. So Jesus decides to withdraw from the Jerusalem and Judea scene and to get away from the center of power and the spotlight of Jerusalem, and he heads back north to his home region, the region of Galilee. Matthew writes this, and he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria. And they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. This is where we are in the story. We are in the early days of the public life and ministry of Jesus. What he has been waiting for all his life, the work of his Father, the work that his Father sent him to do, to fulfill his Father's plans and promises, to bring the salvation of God to his people, to announce the coming kingdom of God, and to teach people about it, and call them to repentance and faith, and to receive the forgiveness of God, and prepare for his kingdom. Jesus has now begun all of that. And we've covered several events so far as Jesus is traveling and teaching in Galilee. He's made his home as Capernaum at this point as well, and he does spend some time there, but he's often out and about, actually mostly often out and about in the countryside visiting other towns. And he told the people in Capernaum this, when they were pressing him to stay, you might remember, Luke 4:43, Jesus tells the crowds, "I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns as well, for I was sent for this purpose." So Jesus and his disciples are often out and about, away from Capernaum, away from home. We've seen him actually rejected at Nazareth, his hometown, and even though they know his reputation, they know what he can do, and even though he casts a demon out with a word right in front of them, they don't believe he can be the Messiah. And then they try and kill him for claiming to be so. We've also seen that the people of Nazareth aren't the only people who don't believe Jesus, who don't like what he's saying. Everybody seems to like the miracles, but not everybody is so thrilled with the message. And although Jesus is relatively out of reach of the leadership in Jerusalem at this point, they can't really do too much to him here in Galilee, being a different Roman jurisdiction. The Sanhedrin still does have a lot of power and influence, not just down in Judea and Jerusalem, but some up north. But there's not much authority they have to stop Jesus when Jesus is ministering in Galilee. Stop him from doing what he's doing and saying what he's saying. Stop him from healing people of their afflictions or calling them to turn their hearts towards God and teaching them about his kingdom. But as we've seen, the rulers of the day, they're not going to sit back and do nothing. And they begin to send some of their people to follow Jesus around and to listen to what he's saying, to keep an eye on him, and to try and see if there's a way to get rid of him. The Pharisees and the scribes are especially going to take on the main responsibility of this task of watching Jesus. They take a very active interest in the problem of Jesus, and to them, he's a problem. Reality is, less than a year prior to this time, it was the Pharisees who who the people held in the highest regard when it came to matters of faith in God. The people of Israel highly esteemed the Pharisees and the scribes for their law-keeping and their scriptural knowledge. And here in just a few short months, they've watched their popularity with the people just crumble, as the eyes and the ears of the people have now turned to an itinerant carpenter from the backwoods of Galilee. Not only did the Pharisees not like his tremendous popularity with the people, they do not like some of the things that are coming out of his mouth either. They don't believe him that he's the God's Messiah. So when Jesus tells the paralyzed man that his sins are forgiven, the Pharisees have an issue. Jesus is like, I am God's Messiah, and so you know what I can do? I can give the people God's forgiveness. That's what I can do. I can pronounce them forgiven by God. And the Pharisees don't agree. They're like, no, you're not, and no, you can't. There's only one who can forgive sin, and that's God, and you aren't him. Last week, we saw Jesus really touch a nerve with the Pharisees when he and his disciples seemed to show no regard for the main thing it meant to be a Pharisee, keeping the laws of the Sabbath, their Sabbath laws, the laws they made up about Sabbath keeping. See, Sabbath keeping was kind of the showcase, the litmus test for being a good Pharisee, a good keeper of the law. And in their zeal to be good keepers of the law, good keepers of the Sabbath, they'd been at it for generations by now. They had codified what it meant to be good Sabbath keepers. They had taken God's plain and simple command for his people to rest from work one day out of 7, and they had made by this time over 600 rules about how that rest was to look. Over 600 directives as to what a good Sabbath observer was to do or not do to properly keep the Sabbath. Anyway, the Pharisees were known for their Sabbath keeping. They loved keeping all their rules. It's how they proved their superior righteousness to others and each other. And on one Sabbath, as they're watching and no doubt muttering and complaining about Jesus, they observe his disciples breaking one of their Sabbath rules by grabbing grain in their hands and rubbing it together to remove the husk and then eating it as a snack as they're walking. And they're not impressed with this infraction, and they decide to speak up to Jesus about it. And they say to Jesus, look, your disciples are doing what it is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Hey, Jesus, your disciples aren't following our rules. And Jesus said, I'm so sorry. And he ordered his disciples to apologize and stop grabbing grain and obey their Sabbath rules. No, it didn't quite go like that. What does Jesus think of their made-up rules? Does he appreciate the lists of do's and don'ts that the Pharisees have come up with for the behavior of God's people on their day of rest? No, far from it. Reality is Jesus is getting pretty fed up with these guys already. Pretty fed up with all their objections and pretty fed up with what they've done to his Father's command for a day of rest for his children, for sure. See, it was God's desire that his people should have a day off from the burdens of this world. A day to remember that God made this world a place of rest, a place where he provided all that his people needed. He gave them a home, and he gave them their food. That's what it was like in the beginning. He created this world so that he could live at rest with his people. And one day a week, God wanted his people to experience that rest, or at least as much of it as they could, as a reminder of God's original design and as a reminder of the rest to come. The eternal rest that God has promised is in store for our future. A day where God will once again dwell on the earth with his people, providing for everything they need. The whole earth now a new and eternal Eden. God's Sabbath was to remind people of that rest to come. that coming day of eternal rest for the whole earth. The whole earth free from the burdens of this fallen age, finally. And the Pharisees had taken that day, the Sabbath, the day God wanted his people to have just a little taste of the rest he wants to give them, the day that God wanted his people to set down the burdens of this life. The Pharisees has turned his Father's day of rest into a day of so constricting that the people could hardly do anything for fear of breaking the rules. They had taken God's day meant for freedom and rest and had turned it into the most oppressive and restrictive day of the week, and Jesus is not pleased about it. He wasn't pleased with what they had done to his Father's house, remember? They had turned the temple that was supposed to be a place that showed off the glory of his Father into a marketplace where they got rich off the backs of the people. And he's not pleased with what they've done with his Father's day either. They'd taken the one day a week of rest that his Father wanted to give his people and turned it into a day more burdensome than the other 6. You know what else Jesus is already tired of with these guys? Their constant complaining about his disciples. See, they can't handle the fact that he hasn't chosen them. Jesus has not called any of the Pharisees to be his disciples. Instead, he's called fishermen, and even, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, a tax collector. Jesus has overlooked the religious establishment of the day and has passed over the powerful and has instead asked regular people to be a part of his group. And the Pharisees are incredulous. Reality is, a big part of their disbelief in Jesus is due to the fact that, well, they can't believe that Jesus is God's Messiah, because in their minds, if he was really the Messiah, who would he be asking to follow him? Them, the Pharisees. And since Jesus is not showing a lot of respect for them, he's not asking them to join his team. Well, they're having a hard time with that. And they're offended. And they feel snubbed at not being chosen. And so what do? They complain about the men who have been chosen every chance they get. Question: why didn't Jesus choose the Pharisees as his disciples? Why didn't Jesus choose any of the religious or political establishment to join his team? Well, Jesus has already told them back when they first started complaining about his choice of disciples. It's in Luke 5. Remember when Jesus called Levi the tax collector to follow him? You can look there, Luke chapter 5. What did Levi do? He threw a party for Jesus. And who came to the party? All of Levi's friends, the fringe minority, the lowlifes, the outcasts, the criminals. And Jesus and his disciples do what no self-respecting Pharisee would ever do. They join in the party and sit down with Levi and his friends to enjoy the feast. And the Pharisees look on this unclean situation and say to Jesus, hey, your disciples, they look pretty comfortable with all these sinners, meaning our disciples would never do this. And Jesus looks at them and tells them, you want to know why these guys are my disciples? You want to know why I didn't choose any of you? Luke 5, verse 36. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins, for no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. Jesus gives them 3 reasons why his disciples are not them. 3 little parables about his choice of disciple. The first explanation is about garments. He says if someone has 2 garments, and one is old and one is new, he would never take apart the new garment to put a patch on the old one. What would you do? You just wear the new one. Right? Rather than wrecking the new one to wear the old one with a mismatched patch on it, no one would do that. And then he says, no one would put new wine in old wineskins. This would be something that people would know. It would be just common sense to them. Wine storage basically has 2 stages. Freshly pressed wine was put into stone jars to ferment for a while. And after that initial fermentation process was complete, the wine could then be put in wineskins for storage and transportation. And the wine would continue to ferment and react, and the wineskins played a role in that. And the skin would absorb some of the wine, and they would stretch to accommodate the fermentation process until the wine was ready. And everyone knew you can't put new wine into old wineskins. They can't take the pressure. They can't contain the new wine. They will break. They will fail. Everyone knows if you want new wine, you need new wineskins for it. You get what Jesus is saying here? What he's saying to the Pharisees? You guys are the old garment. I have come with a new one. And I didn't bring it to rip apart, rip off a patch, and patch up your tired old thing with it. You guys are the old wineskin. You're too soaked in the old wine. I have new wine. It can't be put in you. You won't be able to hold it. My wine is new, so it needs new vessels. And then Jesus gets to the heart of the issue with the Pharisees. He says it in verse 39. And no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. Jesus is like, here's the other thing, Pharisees. You guys like your old wine. You guys prefer the old wine. I'm offering something new here, and you guys are too satisfied with the old to want it. That's why I'm not choosing you as my disciples. The old is passing away. I'm bringing new things, and for what I'm bringing, the old vessels just will not do. We can pick up the story here. Jesus and his disciples and the Pharisees in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Jesus has just told them that he doesn't appreciate all their Sabbath rules. And far from rebuking his disciples for breaking their rules, sorry, we're over in Mark now. Mark chapter 3. Far from rebuking his disciples for breaking their rules, when they complained to Jesus about his disciples' actions, he asked the Pharisees, have you guys even read the Bible? 3 times he calls into question their knowledge of God and his word, and they aren't pleased. Mark chapter 3, verse 1. And he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he'd heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. Jesus is like, okay, you guys are so smart, so godly. Tell me this about your Sabbath rules. Okay, it's not lawful to work on the Sabbath, but is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? What are they going to say? No. No. God is against doing good on the Sabbath. When would God ever be against doing good? They can't say no, but they can't say yes either. Right? That would be agreeing with Jesus, and they don't want to do that. Certainly not in front of everyone, so they have nothing to say, and they stay silent. Verse 5, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Can you kind of picture this little standoff a little? Both sides angry with the other. The Pharisees seething because they've been silenced by the questions of Jesus, embarrassed in front of everyone, being shown up by this country bumpkin from Galilee and his uneducated disciples. And Jesus angry with their disbelief, angry at the burdens that they've laid on the people, angry that they've destroyed his Father's day of rest by turning it into a giant to-do and do-not list. So he tells the man, hold out your hand. And as he does, he's healed right in front of their eyes, and everyone sees it. Jesus looking at the Pharisees as it happens, daring them to voice an objection to doing good on the Sabbath. Are they going to speak up? Verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. No, they're not going to speak up. They don't have anything to say to him. They've got nothing to stand on. They have no defense of their position. They just love their rules. Rest and doing good are not something they're concerned about or want to argue about, so they leave. And what do? Where do they go? These guys hate what Jesus is doing and saying so much by now that they are willing to go to the Herodians for assistance. They're now going to enlist the help of their political enemies in their efforts to destroy Jesus. The Herodians were a political faction in Israel that supported the Tetrarch Herod Antipas. The guy who had John the Baptist thrown in jail, that guy. He was the Roman-appointed ruler over Galilee, and he's the authority in Galilee. And the Herodians were in favor of working with Rome. They even wanted to have Herod made king of that region. They did not have the same political or religious views as the Pharisees at all. Yet when it comes to Jesus, the Pharisees have no problem turning to them for help and getting rid of him. Let's continue the story back to Mark 3. Mark 3:7. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. Okay, these people are coming from everywhere. When the great crowd heard all he was doing, they came to him, and he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. Again, with the demons, we covered this a couple of times. Why he tells them to keep their mouths shut. He needs no testimony from them. He doesn't want anyone listening to them. Whenever Jesus encounters them, he's just like, shut up and get lost, and they do. And so Jesus leaves the synagogue, and he heads down to the Sea of Galilee, that is, and the crowds are pressing, and the people desperate to be healed, and Jesus is like, go get a boat. These people might just crowd us right into the water. We're going to see this a few times, actually, in the story. The crowd's so thick that Jesus has to teach from a boat. Sometimes the only way to get away, to get home, is by boat. Okay. What's Jesus going to do with all the complaining from the religious leadership? All of their objections to what he's doing and what he's saying. And what is he going to do about all the derision that the Pharisees are leveling against his choice of disciple? All their contempt for the ordinary men that Jesus has invited to follow him. The constant belittling of his followers. Is he going to tell his disciples to shape up? Start being more respectable. Be more like the Pharisees. Is he going to get a better quality of follower? Is he going to ask some of the righteous people to join him? Is he going to start recruiting more respectable people? Is he going to try to mollify the members of the establishment and woo them over to his side? What's he going to do with his band of fishermen and fringe people and the complaints of the leadership of the religious authorities about them? Verse 13. And he went up on the mountain and called to him those he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. That's what Jesus is going to do with all the complaining of the Pharisees. What's going on here? What is Jesus doing? Seems somewhat formal, doesn't it? I mean, he's already called these guys to follow him. They've been following him for months now. We've already heard those stories. But here we have Jesus calling to himself up onto a mountain those who he wants, and he appoints them and calls them apostles. And he calls and appoints 12 men. Why? What's going on here? What's the purpose of this? Verse 14 says, so that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and have authority over disease and demons. Matthew writes that Jesus called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. Jesus calls up on the mountain 12 men, and then he gives them his authority. We're going to see he's going to send them out with that authority soon. Jesus officially calls and appoints these men to be his apostles, his sent ones. Just like he has been sent by his Father, he's now making it official. You 12 will be my sent ones. You'll be with me. You will do the things that I do. You will be like me. He's doing what he came to do, right? He's came to do something new. And this is a new version of an old scene, an update to a very old event. Look at verse 13 again. He went up on the mountain and called to him those he desired, and they came to him. Maybe some of you have been here on Wednesday nights. Will know this. Can you think of a similar story set up in the Bible? Can you think of another time that God was on a mountain calling out to his people? Yeah, way back in the beginning, right? When God had just delivered his people from slavery in Egypt, where do they go when they escape? Where's the first place God leads them? Mount Sinai. When God leads his people out of Egypt and toward the promised land, he has them stop and camp for about 2 years at the foot of a mountain called Sinai. And it's at this time that one of the most famous stories in the Bible happens. If you're old enough, you might even remember the movie. It's at Sinai where God gives his famous 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are just part of the laws and the instructions that God gave to his people while they were camped at Sinai. Remember, this large group of people, over 1 million people now, maybe 2, they're not yet a nation. They have never been a nation. Their only experience of nationhood is under the thumb of the Egyptians. So God takes some time to tell his people what exactly it means to be his people. How are they going to go about being his nation? So God had made a covenant with Abraham over 400 years before that one day God would make a great nation out of Abraham's descendants, a nation that would bless all the other nations of the earth, a nation that would display his glory in this world. And when the Israelites emerge, a new people from the clutches of Pharaoh, God has some things to say about going forward. He has some instructions and some promises for them. And those instructions and promises come in the form of another covenant. The story is found in Exodus chapters 19 through 24, if you want to read it. We don't have time to go through all of it today, but let me just give you a couple of the highlights. Basically, it goes like this. God and his people make a deal. They agree to covenant together. God says, here's what it means to be my people. Here's what it means to represent me in this world. Here are my instructions, and here's my law. And God said, here's the deal. If you guys follow my instructions, if you live up to my purposes for you, well, then I'll protect you, and I'll provide for you, and I'll bless you beyond your wildest imaginations. But, here's the second part of the deal. If you guys decide to not follow my instructions, if you decided to abandon the purpose for which I created you, then I will curse you, and I will drive you from the land. That's the deal God put before his people. What did his people say in response to this proposed covenant by God? Well, Exodus 19:7 says, So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, All the Lord has spoken, we will do. The people accept the deal. They affirm their intention to keep the covenant. All that's left to do now is have a covenant ceremony. Remember the ceremony that God and Abram had when God gave him his promises? When God promised that Abram would have a son, that through that son he would build a nation that would bless all nations? It's in Genesis 15. Actually, God performs a covenant ceremony. He has Abraham slaughter some animals and cut them in half. And then God walks through the split carcasses, declaring his promises to Abraham. The meaning is, I will die like these animals if I break my word. Well, there's a new covenant to be made in Sinai, and both parties are in agreement, and they just need to have a ceremony. So God tells Moses, in 3 days, I'm going to come down on the top of the mountain. Don't let anyone get close or they'll die. No one's to come up on the mountain. So on the morning of the 3rd day, the people assemble at the foot of the mountain, and Moses and Aaron and the elders in front of the people. And on the morning of the 3rd day, there were thunders and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain and very loud trumpet blasts, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder, and the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. And Moses told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Can you picture it? The mountain covered in darkness at the top, the people standing before it, trembling and affirming their covenant with God. Moses builds an altar, Covenants require blood, right? And then what else does he do? He sets up 12 stone pillars, sometimes translated memorial stones. It's 12 stone pillars or memorial stones that represent the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. So God is on the mountain, and Moses is at the foot of the mountain where he's built the altar between the mountain and the people. And Moses has set up these 12 memorial stones, 12 pillars that stand in front of the people before the altar, representing the 12 sons of Jacob. See the picture God's painting here? You've got God on one side of the altar and the 12 sons of Jacob on the other, in stone, standing in front of God's people. And when the sacrifices are made to seal the covenant, Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." And Moses took the blood and threw it on the 12 stone pillars and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." They've sealed the deal. The covenant has been sealed in blood. Then this happens. It's actually in Exodus 24:9. Then Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief man of the people of Israel, and they beheld God and ate and drank. God invites who up on the mountain to seal the covenant? The priests, the elders of Israel. Who's not allowed on the mountain that day? The people are not allowed on the mountain. So how did this whole deal turn out for Israel? This whole covenant. Was it a good one? Did it turn out to be everything they hoped it would be? Perpetual prosperity and security. No, the whole thing failed and crumbled. They were unable to fulfill their side of the bargain, their promises, and so they were dispersed into the nations. Now, God in his faithfulness, he's called his people back, but as soon as they're back, they begin their failing efforts once again. And by the time Jesus arrives, the Pharisees are the leaders of yet another corrupted and useful attempt at keeping the covenant. Useless attempt at keeping the covenant. The whole Mosaic covenant has become a sad effort to keep tradition alive by this point. It has no life of its own anymore. It hasn't produced righteousness. It hasn't revealed God's glory to the nations. But Jesus has come for new things. And God's Son, on this day, 1,400 years or so later, Jesus is on another mountain. And he's calling up those that he's choosing. But notice who's not getting chosen this time, and who is. This time it's not the elders and the priests who are getting called up to join God. This time it's the people that are being called up, and the elders and priests are being left behind at the foot of the mountain because they're no longer needed. Did you catch the feel of the Sinai scene? Yes, the elders and priests were invited up on the mountain where they ate and drank with their God, but you get this sense that it was a fearful experience, that they were lucky to escape with their lives. Moses says, and God did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. It's kind of like Moses saying, these guys went up on the mountain and lived to tell about it. They saw God and God didn't kill them. What a different feel 1,400 years later when Jesus calls his disciples to come up the mountain to him. The elders of Israel are invited to come up for a fleeting and fearful visit with God, and they had to leave then in order to survive. But Jesus is calling his people up. Mark 3, verse 14, so that they might be with him forever. See, there are new things at hand. Jesus is not here to patch up old clothes. He has new clothing for everyone, robes of white. And the old wine has lost its taste, and Jesus has new wine to be poured, the wine of the kingdom. And the old wineskins just can't hold it. He has not come to perpetuate the old covenant. He's come to live up to it and to accomplish it and therefore to satisfy the terms of that covenant, the terms of the law once and for all. And more than that, he's come with yet another covenant, a new covenant. And not very long from now, Jesus is going to take his 12 chosen men, and he's going to gather them in, and he's going to pour a cup of wine and hold it up in front of them, and he's going to tell them, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. And he's going to go out, and the next day he will walk up another mountain, and his own blood will be spilt, and he will die, and his blood will be sprinkled on his 12 new stones. When he does that old covenant, when he dies, that old covenant, that covenant of law that's been hanging over God's people's heads for centuries, that old covenant that has now become so burdensome and so destructive, so not what God wants for his people, that old covenant that's now become the corrupted pursuit of the Pharisees and the money-making scheme of the temple, well, when Jesus dies, he does away with all of it. Jesus, the Son of God, finally lives up to the promise that God's people made all those years ago at the foot of Sinai. Jesus has succeeded where all else have failed. He has fulfilled the law of God. He's satisfied the terms of the covenant of Sinai, and it's time for the old to pass away. Jesus knows that day is coming, and so he's not interested in fixing up the old system. He's bringing a new covenant. He's leaving Sinai behind for a new mountain. And the old ways will not do anymore. And when Jesus calls his men up the mountain, he is choosing new stones, new pillars, new stones, 12 new men who will become his living stones. And he will shed his blood for them. And his blood won't just keep them alive for a year, won't just cover their sin for a while. His blood will wash them clean from the stain of their sin forever. And the people of Israel, God's chosen people, the 12 tribes, failed to live up to their purpose. They failed to represent their God to this world. They failed to lead the other nations to know and love their God. What about Jesus' 12 new guys? The 12 disciples, the 12 men that he called up on that mountain that day. The 12 ordinary guys, none of them priests, none of them leaders of the people. Just regular guys that Jesus appointed to be with him and to be like him and to carry on his work. How did they do with the new covenant? These uneducated fishermen who ate and drank with the outcasts, who didn't follow the proper rules, who didn't have money and power. How did everything go for them? Did the new covenant fail just like the old one? Hardly. It's been 2,000 years since then. And what started with these guys went on to grow into the greatest transformational force in the history of the world, the Church of Jesus Christ. And here we are on the other side of the world, 2 millennia later, and we're still reading and learning from the words and deeds of these men. And why is it that they didn't fail? And that they passed on their faith? Those that they passed on their faith to, they didn't fail either, and so on and so on. Why is that? In the old covenant, generation after generation failed. How is it that generation after generation in the new covenant of Jesus, they just keep on persevering? It can't be stamped out. It can't be stopped. Is it because the disciples and their descendants are so good at keeping the covenant? They're so much more faithful than Israel was? No. They and we are just as bad as Israel at covenant keeping. But you know who's great at covenant keeping? You know who has never and will never fail to keep the covenant? Jesus. He's the covenant keeper. Jesus is God. He is the eternal Son. It was he who walked through the dead animals as he made his promises to Abraham. And it was he who died to make them all come true. And it was he who thundered on Sinai that day when the covenant of law was ratified. And it was he who was the one to fulfill it. And it's he who will call up his disciples on another mountain soon. And he'll give them a new covenant, a new instructions, and a new promise before he goes to his Father. It's in the end of Matthew, in Matthew 28. Now the disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. And Jesus said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all I have commanded you." Those are the new instructions. This is what their assignment is. This is their purpose. And what about the new promise? What about the new deal? Here it is, the last words of the book of Matthew. And behold, remember, be confident. Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. That's the promise. Remember why he called his disciples up and appointed them? So that they would be with him and that they would be like him. And then he goes to the cross to make all of that possible. And then before he leaves, he calls the disciples and tells them, now it's your turn. Now you go and do what I did. You go and you make disciples. And he promises that he will be with them until the job is done. And he is the covenant keeper, and he will not fail. And he hasn't yet, and he never will. And the work that he gave his disciples continues today, still all over the world. The disciples don't know any of this yet, as they hear Jesus name them official apostles. They have no idea what's in store for them. They're just 12 guys following Jesus. 12 ordinary men who will one day go on to do extraordinary things. They will do what God's people are supposed to do. They will go to the nations to lead them to know and love the God of Israel, and this world has never been the same. If you were about to embark on a project, a unique project, an unprecedented effort of some kind, and you were assembling a team of people to help you do it, who would you want on that team? Some experts? All the ones with the right experience that might contribute to your cause? Yeah? Not our God. He doesn't need the religious. He doesn't need the power. He doesn't need the experts. He doesn't need the rich. He doesn't need the educated. 1 Corinthians 1:27 says, but God chose what is foolish in this world to shame the wise, and God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in this world as the means to accomplish his plans. God's not looking for superstars, for people with the right background, the right experience, the right skills and resources to get the job done. He doesn't need any of that. What God wants is people who believe him and love him. That's it. That's the kind of people he called up on the mountain to join him that day. And that's the kind of people he is still calling to join him today. The people that had to stand far off, uninvited to the mountain of God, they've been brought near. And Jesus now calls all people everywhere. Come up on the mountain and join me. Come be with me forever. Whose names hold up the New Jerusalem? In the end, whose names are written on the foundation stones of God's new and eternal home on earth? Not the rich, not the powerful, not the kings, not the famous. There are no names of Sadducees or Pharisees or scribes or Sanhedrin written on it. There's no David, there's no Solomon, there's no Joshua, there's no Moses, not even the 12 sons of Jacob or his father Isaac or even Abraham himself have their names written on the foundation of God's new home. It's these guys, the ones the Pharisees mocked, the ones that the elites looked down upon and shook their heads at and discounted as unworthy. That's whose names are written on the foundation of God's home. Here's the thing, though. The Pharisees were right. Those men that Jesus chose were unworthy. But that's the point, because their unworthiness is no object for Jesus. He is the worthy one, and he can do anything. And he can satisfy the law of God and do away with that burden forever. And he can take 12 ordinary, unworthy guys, people just like you and me, and with them he can change the world, because he's the covenant keeper, and he is with us always, even to the end of the age. Look, I don't know how broken you think you are. I don't know how messed up your past has been. I don't know where you might fall on the scale of things, whether you feel like a Pharisee, a tax collector, or a fisherman, or whatever. It doesn't matter. Jesus is calling you. He wants you to join him. He doesn't care about where you're coming from or what you're bringing with you. He just wants you to come. He wants you to believe him. He wants you to put your trust in him. He wants you to come be with him and be like him. Your name might not be written on the foundation of God's new home. Mine isn't either. But be assured his home is for you if you want it to be. All you have to do is answer the call. and he will name you his, and he will never leave you. He didn't fail his disciples. He won't fail you. He'll be with us all, even to the end of the age, just like he said.